Today I'm going to be forging the tumbler for the lock. It's the last piece that we need to finish the mechanism. The tumbler is an important part of the lock because it keeps the bolt from moving around inside the lock. Usually they're made out of two pieces. There's the tumbler itself, which is usually just a simple lever that locks the bolt in position, and then there's a spring that holds it in place. This particular design has the two features combined into one unit. And that was quite common on small locks where you just don't have the room to build this in two pieces. I'm going to be forging the tumbler out of a 3/8 piece of round spring steel. I'm going to be heat treating this because the spring does have to move a fair amount and it does need to be very flexible. The forging is pretty straightforward. The spring is just a long flat plate and that transitions into a narrow tail section, which is the actual tumbler. Because you're working with spring steel for this project, you have to be really careful of your heats. Don't forge below an orange heat and don't heat the metal above a bright yellow heat. It's a pretty narrow range and the bar cools quickly, so you need to be prepared to just take a lot of short heats and just take your time as you're forging this. If you try to rush the process, you might put stress into the bar that's going to result in cracks later on as you heat treat it. I usually leave the forging fairly thick. The outside tends to decarburize, so you want to grind past that anyway. So you leave it thick, you grind it thin. That's basically always how it's been done. I'll take the shape most of the way down with the flap wheel on my angle grinder, and then I'll finish by draw filing because for my setup that's the easiest way to get a nice smooth finish. So here's the completed profile. That short saw cut that you see is going to allow me to bend that section downward and create a dog that's going to lock into the bolt and hold it in position. The flat section on the right of the screen is the spring, and the long narrow section is the tumbler that's going to be lifted by the key. I'm going to start by bending the dog in position. I've set it up in a vise to give me a little bit more control over what I'm doing. Now I apologize for my hand being in the way here, but basically all I'm doing is bending the dog around the curved point of a fuller so it doesn't have a sharp crease. So I've set it up above the jaws of the vise so I can heat that section without the vise jaws sucking all the heat out, and then the curved fuller gives me the rounded corner that I want to make sure that I don't create a weak area that might fail. Bending the tumbler can be a little frustrating. It needs to fit in a pretty tight space and it has to be sized just right to work properly. So to figure out the proper location for the tumbler, you need to figure out where the notches are going to be in the bolt. So what I've done here is I've taken a Sharpie and I've marked the location of the furthest possible position that I can go on the left side of the bolt, and you can see that dark mark right up against the left guide. Next I'm going to move the bolt all the way to the right up against the right hand guide for the bolt. Wherever that mark on the bolt ends up is where the dog on the tumbler needs to be positioned. So the leg of the tumbler needs to be bent around behind the bolt to allow for the dog of the tumbler to be in this position. And here again I'm just using a torch to heat the section. What I want to bend is above the vise jaws, and I'll be using a round punch this time to wrap the bend around. Even though this isn't technically the spring and it's not going to be flexing, I still don't want any sharp corners or areas that could crease that might create, weak areas that could fail. Because once this lock is assembled, there's no taking it apart again without destroying it. So I want to do everything I can to make sure that it's going to last for years. This bend is kind of a critical bend, so I really want to make sure that I don't crease anything here in case I have to make any adjustments. I'm trying to get the bottom of the tumbler to line up so that it falls about 1/3 of the way down into the notch of the bolt. In that position, the key coming around is going to be able to lift the tumbler out of the way and move the bolt into a new position. If you don't have it down low enough, it won't lift the tumbler and the dog high enough to clear the bolt. And if you have the tumbler set too low, then the key is going to be lifting the tumbler and the dog too high out of the bolt, and that's just going to place unnecessary strain on the spring. Once you're happy with how everything's lining up, you need to bend the end of the tumbler back up so that it touches the spring. They were always made that way. I think it's just to give added support to the tumbler so that it doesn't flex when the key is lifting it. So I've placed a couple of chalk marks on the vise, and I've measured those by lining up the back plate with the spring and the tumbler, and then I'll just heat up the section and bend it with the bending forks. And then once I have everything fine-tuned the way I want it, I'll cut the leg to length and tuck it inside behind the spring. So the final forming process on this thing is to actually shape the spring. The only critical part of the spring is to make sure that the loop of the spring it fits tightly around whatever bar you plan on using for the pin. If there's a loose fit there, the tumbler is going to be able to move from side to side and it won't lock the bolt in the proper position and you won't be able to open and close the lock. So it's important to take the time to get a tight fit there. What I've done here is I've used a pin that's slightly smaller than the one that I want to use. So I'll be driving the actual pin into that position, so it's going to be a guaranteed fit. Heat treating a complicated shape is always a challenge if you don't have a temperature controlled furnace that you can use. So what I've done here is I have a bowl of sand. It's just regular play sand, I believe, and I'm going to be heating that up in my forge. I've taken a piece of steel and polished it up, and I'm going to be using that as a temperature gauge. When I get that to a full blue color, I know the sand is hot, and I'll be able to bury my tumbler into that sand, and I'll be able to draw the temper that way. And it should be a nice even temper right through the entire piece. So here's the bowl heating up in the forge, and I have the temperature pretty much where I want it. I've already hardened the tumbler, and I'm just waiting for this to get up to temperature so I can bury it in the sand and draw the temper. The temperature difference that you see here is because the piece was sitting on top of the sand and it had more or less contact with the sand. So I'm putting the test piece back in the sand so that I can make sure that I have it at the right temperature and that it's going to stay there. I don't want to heat it up too much because then I'll draw the temper too far and I'll have to redo the whole process. So I'm going to keep an eye on it for a few minutes. If it stays at the full blue that I want, I know that I have a stable temperature and I'll be ready to bury the actual piece in the sand. So I have the tumbler in the sand, and I'm just keeping a very low heat to make sure that the sand doesn't cool down. You can see the smoke rising off of the sand. That's from the oil quench for the tumbler. So oil starts to smoke at around 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm trying to get to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm thinking when the smoke stops, I should be pretty much at the right temperature. I'll let it sit for a couple of minutes more, but that should give me the correct temper. So here's the piece out of the sand, and I'm quite happy with it. It seems to have a pretty even temper. It has a steel gray blue look underneath the scale, so it looks like it did a great job of doing a very even temper. The only thing that didn't work out was my stainless steel bowl that I got at the dollar store. Obviously, it melted a little bit. I started losing sand into the fire, but I did get it tempered before I lost too much sand. I probably should have used a hot plate or something, to, anything where I'd be able to dial in the temperature a little bit better. But this was just a test, and I'm happy with how it turned out, so I'll figure out the rest of it later. So here's the finished tumbler roughly in position. The spring tension comes from the top edge of the spring just pushing up against the inside of the cover for the padlock. So I have a little bit of trimming and fitting to do there, but basically this is how it goes together. Hi, I'm Dennis, and thanks for watching. If you're interested in supporting this channel and you can spare $2.50 every month, click on the Patreon logo at the bottom of the screen. I'd really like to be able to expand the content of this channel and turn it into the best resource for anyone wanting to learn traditional crafts, but I need your help to get there. Thank you.